Greetings, friends, and welcome to Tim Kirby Russia. I, geopolitical analyst and radio talk show host Tim Kirby, tell you about the events of our days, but from the angle of an insider within Russia. I've been here for 15 years, and hopefully that insight could help. But today's big insight is going to come from our guest, Matthew Ehret, who is a lecturer, journalist, and the founder of the Canadian Patriot Review. He's going to tell us all about the big financial rigged game that's happening all around us. But for now, let me tell you about the Russian perspective of things from the standpoint of being a rigged game. Well, there's a lot of moments that have happened since the Russian Revolution that could lead many people in this country to think that they're sort of playing by a rigged game. In many ways, it's really the international organizations that have a lot of influence on the way the world is, or at least in the past have done so, are really based in the West. But we'll get to that pretty soon. The first element of a rigged game were the very first sanctions put on the young Soviet Union, which led to what the Ukrainians call the Holodomor. They want to always create this, the event of the starvations of sort of the early 1930s. They always try to want to turn this into some sort of genocide created by Moscow against them. Well, first off, the borders of that genocide were very broad, and it killed a lot of Russian people. And they forget to mention that it was the Western sanctions that really allowed the Soviet Union to export only grain. This is when the Soviet Union was very poor, deep in the revolutionary phase, desperate for money. What do the Western powers do? Make it so the only thing they can do is get rid of food. Of course, it didn't happen to help that the Soviets themselves did a bad job of converting their agricultural system from the previous system into their delightful collective farm system. The getting rid of the kulaks didn't exactly go smoothly. That didn't help. But the West sure put the icing on the starvation cake. So, moving on deeper in the Cold War, all Americans know that you can't buy Cuban cigars in America, right? There's an embargo. That embargo was designed to, break the revolution so that way they would return to the happy fold of capitalist countries. Didn't work so well. But one thing they did, maybe a lot of Americans don't know, is that they did pretty much the same thing against the Soviets. Too bad they didn't pick that for China. China sure did a good job of importing to our shelves being communist. But the Soviet Union, and I believe Vietnam and some other communist or communist-leaning nations were all put into a big list of bad guys in what's called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which you should all look up. And that's really one of the major reasons why you didn't see many Soviet products in America, if any. Now, some would say, oh, well, all the Soviet products were garbage. Well, not so much. I would definitely say that American capitalism of the sort of golden Americana era of, the 50s going into the 60s, the 70s had some problems, but American goods manufactured in America at the time, yeah, they were better than the Soviet Unions. I would say pretty much hands down in most regards. But don't we believe in free markets? Don't we believe in having the choice to choose to have different things? Maybe you want to try something built in the Soviet Union, especially because things in the Soviet Union tended to have that sort of like 1930s mentality longer, that when you make a washing machine, you make that washing machine so your grandchildren will use it. So there may have been some value in being able to select Soviet products, but it was forbidden, of course. So in a lot of ways, not allowing the Soviets to even compete outside of their near borders with their communist allies was definitely a rigged economic game, which certainly didn't help the Soviet Union. Another thing that happened before that, the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system is a big rigged game, making us all use the dollar. Of course, Russia now is very famous for trying to push away from that. But Bretton Woods was definitely not to the advantage of the Soviet Union, and certainly not to early Russia. And that is an international system that really the United States got to put in place because the real true big victors of World War II were the Americans. Obviously, the Russians always say, no, we were the ones who won the war. Yeah, Russian blood won the war, but the American economy did so good after the war and thanks to the war. So, yeah, and also thanks to the Bretton Woods system. Another would be, although since the Soviet Union was on the winning side, the Soviet Union is one, and then now Russia has that seat on the UN Security Council. It's one of the big dogs with the veto, which is very nice. But don't forget where the UN was organized, where the offices are, and although it may be a United Nations, it's a sort of United Nations around Washington. And so are many international organizations like the International Olympic Committee, FIFA with their soccer and all that. Many things, be they something stupid like sports or something very important like the United Nations, More often than not, they revolve around the West. They revolve around Western standards. But so, anyways, as you see on sort of a grander scale, maybe it's Russia's fault that Russia, especially due to the revolution, missed out on a lot of opportunities to create its own massive sports leagues, to do a lot of things first, which America took advantage of after World War II. Russia was rebuilding under communism. America was exploding forward under capitalism. So maybe to an extent, why the game is rigged against Russia is it's always been a little bit behind the game. But maybe now that's changing. Because if you look at organizations like BRICS, which is one of the first sort of counter moves to creating a major international organization not revolving around somewhere, around Washington D.C. that that was a big deal, and BRICS definitely came under attack very quickly, especially on the Brazilian front, if you know what I'm talking about. But yeah, so we have BRICS, and maybe even more importantly, is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is really united in a somewhat military, somewhat economic, somewhat maybe ideological, somewhat alliance of convenience, the entire Eurasian landmass. I think it's something like the populations add up to 3.5 billion people, and it's an absolute economic military titan, and that also helps beating the rigged game of having NATO basically go all over the world doing whatever it wants, which is whatever Washington wants. So as you see, a lot of these rigged games of the Cold War and the sort of triumphant period after the Cold War are starting to be eroded away from, but still Russia's in many ways has to play by a different standard than the West does, and that's always very frustrating to Russia. Now, one thing that may actually sort of take your frustration levels even higher is not our guest, he's awesome, but he's information about how the international financial system rigs the game not just against Russia, but against all of us, be we nations or individuals. So, yeah, prepare to get a little bit fired up here. So, anyways, let's get to meet Matthew Ehret, who is a lecturer, journalist, and the founder of the Canadian Patriot Review. Okay, Mr. Ehret, let's start with the big question. In what way is the international finance system rigged, and in whose favor?
Well, that is quite the question to start off with, and certainly I don't think it would come as any of a surprise to your viewers that the system itself is rigged in favor of a supranational. I wouldn't say it's rigged in favor of any particular nation state per se, but when you look at where the power structures actually reside, not where we're told they reside, but where they really reside, we have in existence on the earth today, as we always have, a financier oligarchy, which exists with a power structure and a bureaucracy and a system of management above that of nation states anywhere in the world. The creation of the modern incarnation of the transatlantic centered financial system took on the virulent form of a cancer that we know and despise today, largely with the floating of the US dollar onto the floating exchange rates off of the gold reserve system in 1971, when a new paradigm was put into place that asserted without any evidence that the former industrial age after World War II, where we were building big things and we were building our industries and manufacturing, that was the old wisdom, and that the new wisdom, and this is people like Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, a lot of the Trilateral Commission crew that came in with David Rockefeller's operation in the 70s, they were basically of the view that, the new order will be based upon a consumer society. We will now just have services. We will begin to outsource our manufacturing sector to poor countries. We will load these poor countries with ever greater rates of unserviceable debts on the one hand, while we do the same to the first world countries who will become more and more decadent by just consuming Walmart, things from dollar stores and Walmarts instead of producing for themselves. And deregulation of the banking system will govern where money is accumulated from via speculation on the one hand, which really took off in the early 80s, but it began in the 70s. The merger of, too big to fails to the creation of universal banking institutions that made speculation more and more of a driving force of the economy. So people lost a sense of where real economic value should have come from, which former generations understood. which is the productive base of the economy. Infrastructure was also atrophied as we stopped investing in the longer term cycles. And so who benefited in all of that? Was it the United States? Not really. They were hollowed out and turned into a basket case, debt-based speculative bubble behemoth. No poor country benefited by and large. So who did? It was an international coterie of financiers and middlemen who largely we see operating in high echelons within the Davos crowd in the World Economic Forum, if you want to get a sense of some of the characters, at least as far as upper level managers are concerned. So yeah, it is tilted. It's a rigged game, but it's not tilted in any particular nation's favor.
Okay, so what you're saying is that some sort of dark figures have really rigged reality in their favor against almost all of us. That's a pretty big claim. Could you please go back in time a little bit and tell us the history behind your reasoning? How do we get from point A to the awful point B where we're at right now?
Well, I think that if you can't really answer the question if you don't look at intention, which some people say you're not allowed to do because that leads you into conspiracies, which is not responsible scientific method. We don't all intelligent people know that there's no such thing as conspiracies, so don't bother going past that electric fence. However, I think that when you look at history from a conspiratorial angle, which is the approach I take, and I think most of the responsible researchers that I respect tend to also acknowledge that intentions, goals, and ideas that are either right or wrong shape the waves of history. Much of the Cold War really, honestly, shouldn't have happened. It did happen, but when you look at the type of momentum that Stalin, Roosevelt, leaders in China were all creating at the end of World War II, when finally the Wall Street, London-funded fascist machine was being put down, there was a vision of a post-war age of win-win cooperation that Roosevelt had negotiated with leaders from all over the world who were about to put into effect big projects, what some had called the internationalization of the New Deal, to help nations stand on their own 2 feet, liberate former colonialized nations. The Pan-African movement was driven by this, people like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. And it was only with Roosevelt's early death and the ouster of a lot of his allies like Henry Wallace and Dexter White, who were all labeled red commies and they were crushed, that you had the creation of an Anglo-American alliance. You had the creation of, the Cold War under Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, and a new dynamic was put into place that was really bipolar and insane. But the whole thing was always it was never really based upon capitalism versus communism. That was largely a narrative that polarized people around a false dichotomy and had them essentially live in a world of mutually assured terror and destruction, which is where we saw in many ways the recapture during this period of nations that had fought for liberty in the past, like the United States, like many in Europe. And in the Western case, a big part of that recolonization of the United States happened through the mass deregulation of their banking system. Even if it was the Cold War, that's what happened, and it basically set into motion a process of privatization. Anything goes, myopic social Darwinism that just maximized shareholder value, which we saw concentrated in the form of what happened to Russia in the 1990s under Gorbachev and Yeltsin with perestroika. So Russia just got a heavy dose of that in the early throughout the 1990s, which they're still recovering from. But it was something that had already been given as a poison to the West for a longer period of time. But it was always designed to bring the world to the exact same type of place, which was ultimately the failure and breakdown of nation states and the creation of a new type of elite that would then manage a fourth industrial revolution, or the Alvin Toffler had called this the third wave. It had different names. I tend to call it technocratic feudalism. Orwell called it oligarchical collectivism. Same thing.
You've mentioned in your work that we're all heading towards a $1.5 quadrillion derivatives crash. Could you please tell us about these derivatives? What are they, and why do they have so much value?
Well, the economy collapsed in 1987 in October. The stock markets collapsed by 25%. It was by all intents and purposes, the cusp of a new complete breakdown, a new Great Depression. It was already overvalued in terms of financial speculative assets by a fair number of magnitudes. Greenspan at the time was the new governor of the Federal Reserve, the Oracle, and his approach wasn't to actually deal with any of the systemic causes of the breakdown. His approach was to instead normalize and accelerate the practice of derivatives trading, which had formerly been generally seen as a dirty, quasi-illegal thing that many people like Michael Milken, the bond speculator and junk bond trader, had gone to prison for earlier. Essentially, what is a derivative? So a derivative has a variety of species and forms, to these creative financial instruments, but essentially it's taking debts, junk bonds increasingly, so debts that won't be paid, finding different ways of bundling them together and securitizing them as an asset in banks, putting insurance on them, and then speculating on the price of what the values of them will be on spot and futures markets. So increasingly, you could essentially do this for anything. There's weather derivatives, hundreds of billions of dollars of things called weather derivatives, just to give a sense, have been created premised on the idea that, let's say Pepsi shipments to Brazil next month will be affected by the weather. If it's cold, people won't buy Pepsi so much. If there's a hotter season than usual, they'll buy more Pepsi, and you could buy a weather derivative based on what you think the weather is going to be, and then speculate on those, creating what seems to be enormous amounts of financial value on the books, which actually has no real bearing in reality per se, because it's tied to insurance, whether the insurance is going to be higher or lower. Originally, when Greenspan normalized them, there were about $3 trillion by 1992, which is already far too much. But this had grown in leaps and bounds throughout the 90s to when Clinton took down Glass-Steagall, the separation of investment from commercial banking in 1999 as one of his last unfortunate, terrible acts in office. They amounted to 78 or so trillion dollars. Very, very large growth. I mean, that's at that point outpacing the global GDP. By the time that the first wave of the blowout happened in 2008, they amounted to about $740 trillion approximately. Today, it's very difficult. Even professional economists have a difficult time mapping out exactly the number of how much of these derivatives exist in the system today. The estimates fluctuate widely between 1.5 quadrillion to under a quadrillion, but it's hard to say because they're so opaque and hard to define. One thing is for sure, this is far more than the global GDP. The amount of debts, whether it's in commercial real estate, whether it's in still subprime mortgages, which are still a thing that was never properly resolved, whether it's student debts, there's so many forms of debts, national debts that have been securitized. And there's so many points where you could easily see very quickly a default that happens in one sector, which would then spread and cause a mass deleveraging where all of the leverage, the derivative leverage and speculative leverage upon the debt bundles will disappear up in smoke. When people thought that it was just that debt disappearing, no, it's not just the $24 trillion of COVID-related debts incurred by nations over the past 1 year. There's much more built on that in terms of speculative assets. And this is all fictitious capital that's been accumulated to try to project an image of economic growth, wherein the reality is that there has been there's actually been negative growth over the past 40 years of just atrophying of the real physical economy. And when I say real economy, I mean the thing that sustains human life: agriculture, industry, infrastructure, science, and technology. Those things have been atrophying in favor of just growing rates of monetary claims that only exist on paper, but not in reality. And that's the time bomb. That's a time bomb that has been nobly created. The effects of it were always understood, even going back to the 70s when the deregulation began. People like Paul Volcker, who ran the Federal Reserve, was talking about a controlled disintegration of the world economy as a good thing. So the effects of these sorts of processes have been known, and that's why I think of it more as a time bomb set to detonate at a certain pinprick moment, in a similar way that the Great Depression was initiated in 1929, or the Weimar hyperinflation earlier. So yeah, I just say it that way.
Well, I guess I should have gone to an Ivy League school instead for finance. But, anyways, so if we are heading towards some grand financial collapse, when is it going to happen and what is it going to look like?
Yeah, sure. So for the first part of the question, we're sort of it's difficult to say. You can't really give a date or a number because in many ways, when you look at the system as a dynamic, as an organic process, we're sort of living on borrowed time already. There is the element of human free will and perception, which is not really tied to objective reality always, which is a factor in this. It's not the only factor. In fact, reality does exist, and it's sort of, I think, to myself, sort of like the view of somebody who might have jumped out of a tall building, and for a while they might perceive and believe that they are flying, but the reality is quickly racing up to them on the concrete splatter below. So we have some indeterminism as well. The future itself, like there is when the system does collapse, because it can't really do much but collapse. There's a fight over what the reset new system is going to be. So that sense, it's underdetermined. We don't know the date. It could be triggered either the way the Great Depression was triggered, by a willful calling in of broker call loans, which would result in a mass wave of bank panic and defaults, which would then deleverage the system in the same way that it happened in 1929, with the shock, the emotional, psychological shock onto the people that would render them more malleable and accepting of fascism as an economic solution. So there's that aspect. But the question is, will it be? And we could talk about this later. I won't go into detail. But will the new system be premised around the unipolar rules-based order? Sometimes it had formerly been called the New World Order, of what you see coming out of the likes of Klaus Schwab's mouth and others. Or will it be a multipolar type of system founded upon nation states cooperating on building big projects for the future? So there's just that question too. I don't really know the date, and I don't think anybody can really know the date that the system itself will, that the tsunami will hit. I do know that the shockwaves there's precursors. I think that in many ways it did happen. It blew out already in 2008, and we've been living on, like I said, borrowed time. It's been a bailout system ever since.
So, could you tell us what are the new Asian Investment Bank and the BRICS led New Development Bank? And more importantly, why are they so important?
But the AIIB and the New Development Bank, indeed, are two very powerful, potentially very useful instruments for leading the world out of this sort of unipolar cage, which has been run for about 70 years by technocrats managing the IMF, the World Bank, and City of London financial sort of control centers. The effect of the past 70-year system has been just completely destructive. Trillions of dollars, you could say, have in accumulation been emitted by loans to poor countries through these Bretton Woods organizations. But despite that, what we have seen is a destruction of the recipient nations, those lucky enough to receive those loans, have had their ability to stand on their own 2 feet. Not only it not only has failed to service their needs, but it has crippled them even more than they were 50, 60 years ago. And that largely has to do with how things like conditionalities were programmed to entrap nations into ever increasing rates of usurious interest rates. The conditionalities, as we've seen from John Perkins' work on Confessions of an Economic Hitman, were designed to ensure that countries in Africa or South America would never be allowed to use the loans for building infrastructure that would benefit their own country, or industrializing their own country. It would always be premised around the idea of wealth extraction, using foreign corporations to exploit their nation without any of that benefit coming to the people, or raising the nations to a status that would really improve the nation as a whole in its standing as a sovereign member of an international community. So that was consciously destroyed. China, when it created in 2015 the AIIB and the New Development Bank, which was part of the BRICS, at the time Dilma Rousseff and Jacob Zuma were still parts of the BRICS, of South Africa and Brazil. The idea was to create new mechanisms outside, so that the IMF and World Bank wouldn't be the monopolies of credit emissions, and instead these new organizations would be designed to emit credit um, at very favorable interest rates, at very long-term conditions for nations to develop full spectrum economies and stand on their own 2 feet. Now, unfortunately, the new development bank has had some setbacks, which again I don't fully understand, but they have not yet met the challenge. Only $30 billion in 6 years has been emitted, which is not very much compared to what they could feasibly do. The AIIB is much better, but even there's strange things. A lot of their credit has been put into investments into green energy grids and things that don't really benefit the productive powers of nations. There are good infrastructure projects, but I think that the most valuable projects from the BRI, the New Silk Road, are coming out of China's state banks, especially the Import-Export Bank and other members of the state bank community. The AIIB still, I think part of it is when you look at some of the vice presidents of research and planning are British lords and knights, which is a very strange thing. So there seems to be elements of infiltration to subvert these institutions, which is a fight. The good thing is that the AIIB never gave. They allowed everybody. Originally, it was 56 nations. Now it's up to 103 nations who are participants in this. It's open for everybody to join, but only Asian nations are allowed to have dominant voting rights. Other countries can invest. So you could be a Wall Street financier and you're allowed to invest in it. Or you could be London, Honorable Iago London, and be an investor in it. And at least in its constitution, you're not allowed to be a dominant voter in it. You're never going to be allowed to make the rules. You have to abide by the rules that the Chinese and their allies in Asia are setting, which is the right thing you want to do. The new development bank. So again, that could easily become an instrument of amazing growth, poverty alleviation, and progress for around the world. The other thing is the new development bank recently this week has now ushered in members featuring Uruguay, the UAE, and Bangladesh. So it's growing. There seems to be something in the works that could help this take off, along with things like the contingency reserve agreement, which is a $100 billion fund created along with the new development bank to provide a buffer from speculative attacks on economies. So that's also good.
Do sanctions, the kind that have been put on modern Russia in the last few years, do they actually work? Have they been effective? If so, and especially if not, does that say something about the state of affairs in the West? I mean, the sanctions they put against the Soviet Union, to an extent, well, partially got the job done for sure.
Well, I think that a lot of this has to do with Russia and increasingly the greater Eurasian partnership, the multipolar alliance having created a viable alternative financial architecture, which is bringing in increasingly old civilizations that had been abused and manipulated into the mix. So Russia is harmonizing its energy grids increasingly with Iran. Iran has joined the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which itself Russia is a leading figure behind. And together, Iran and China have put online a $400 billion investment strategy over a variety of things: energy, military affairs, economic development. Pakistan is on board. India is which has been walking in two worlds, has increasingly gotten more and more on board with the multipolar alliance. Russia is just seeing a different market, a different community of collaborators that are actually trustworthy. And for the first time, we have whole stratas of great civilizations creating and working together with a common win-win orientation strategically, which we've never really seen in history this way. There's always been usually like one or maybe two nations who try to take a stand, one or the other, sometimes together, but rarely, who are easily picked off by the powers of the private financier, wealth managers, and oligarchs who control intelligence agencies and many other things, who undermine the good. Now, we have such an amazing confluence of nations, and they're all like, even India is working on massive investments into the Russian Far East. So is Japan. Even though both India and Japan have been induced to be anti-China on a variety of levels, they're both integrating with something that China is also a part of with the Polar Silk Road. So I think you just have this confidence in the future and a capacity to carry out development outside of the power structures of the West, which have completely, I mean, lost validity. People are looking at the West as a giant Titanic basket case, throwing around a lot of big words and threats, but I mean, they don't have a lot of means to carry out much, since the U.S. bubble is about to tank. Its debts are unpayable. Its population is committing suicides at greater rates in history and doing drugs at greater rates in history. So it's not really easy to take that thing seriously at this point. It is dangerous because they still do control a vast amount of military equipment and nuclear weapons. So, a wounded beast is never a safe thing to be in the same room with,
So I'd like to thank Matthew very much for coming on the program. That was very insightful. For those of you who are big fans, guess what? We are definitely going to have, coming out very soon, the unedited full interview with Matthew, because there's always a few pieces that don't really seem to fit in the show, but we like to release them anyways. So stay tuned for that. Should be out in a week or 2 weeks. Till then, share, guys. The YouTube algorithms do not like this kind of material. Without your help, this program is going to go nowhere. Please like, share, and subscribe, especially share. Thanks, guys.